McDonald.
Coming up, as the world responds to the coronavirus crisis, we take a look at South Africa, where there have been 61 reported cases.
We look back to another pandemic. Any lessons from the 14th century and the Black Death?
And away from coronavirus, a report from our correspondent in India, 2 weeks after religious violence dominated the news there, around President Trump's visit, of course. This is Newsday.
BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. In Los Angeles and New York, bars, restaurants and cafes have been ordered to close by the mayors of both cities in an attempt to halt the spread of the coronavirus. Theatres on Broadway and cinemas in Hollywood are also shutting. Bill de Blasio, New York's mayor, said he ordered the closures to break the disease's chain of transmission. The US Federal Reserve has cut interest rates by 1 full percentage point to try to limit disruption to the global economy caused by the viral pandemic. The Fed is also pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into financial markets. Other central banks, including China's, have unveiled emergency measures to ensure liquidity. In the US city of Seattle, trials of a vaccine for coronavirus will start later on Monday. The tests, paid for by the US government, will see 45 volunteers inoculated, but none will be infected with the virus. Germany's borders with France, Austria and Switzerland have been closed to all but business and commercial traffic. Schools are also shut, and the capital Berlin has, like many other towns and cities across Europe, closed cafes, restaurants and some shops. At least 26 African nations have now reported coronavirus infections. Kenyan schools remain closed, and foreigners without residency permits travelling from a virus-affected country won't be allowed to enter. Ghana is also carrying out similar measures. And in other news, the front-runner for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, Joe Biden, says he'll choose a woman to be his vice-presidential running mate. In a debate with Bernie Sanders, Mr. Biden also committed to choosing a cabinet which reflected the United States. And a Japanese man has been sentenced to death for a stabbing rampage 4 years ago, in which 19 disabled people were killed at a care home. Satoshi Uematsu had admitted the murders and will be executed by hanging. BBC News.
Many thanks indeed for the latest. This is Newsday once again with Claire and Lawrence. We're going to go back in time and tell you the moving story about how a village in England cut itself off and basically sacrificed itself to try to save others. That's a previous pandemic of bubonic plague about 400 years ago. Any lessons for now? Well, we'll be talking a great deal about what's happening around the world. We've been hearing from Italy, from America, from Africa as well. That's on the way. Also, we're talking about the communal violence in Delhi and elsewhere in India, and Matthew Kenyon is here with the sport, and a lot of the sport, of course, is the effects of coronavirus shutting down events. An update from Matthew in about 10 minutes' time. Stay tuned.
Let's start our roundup looking at South Africa this morning, as the president there has declared a national state of disaster to deal with the coronavirus outbreak. More and more countries on the continent have cases. East Africa is now the last region to confirm infections. Sudan says a 50-year-old man has died, whilst Ethiopia reported a Japanese man who recently travelled to the country has tested positive to COVID-19. We'll get the latest from East Africa shortly, but first to South Africa. And I'm joined now by Leila Majid, journalist and editor at Power 98.7. That's a talk radio station in Gauteng. Welcome to Newsday. Thank you for joining us, Leila. Bring us up to speed then. Good to have you here. Bring us up to speed then. And what's the latest you have figures-wide? How many cases?
So currently we have 61 cases. We've gone from 1 to 61 in 10 days. We've also just confirmed our first local transmission case in the president's announcement last night. So that's where we are in terms of numbers. We haven't had any reported deaths.
And when we look at this, other countries, for example, when you look at the Far East, when you look at Taiwan, as soon as the outbreak happened, they started monitoring, they started testing people. They would go onto aeroplanes to test people coming into the country from China. What is South Africa's been a response to that been so far, as far as testing goes?
So in terms of travellers, especially at our main international airports, including our Tambo Airport, which is in Johannesburg, they're not allowing people, especially if you're coming from overseas, they're not allowing you off the plane until they've checked your temperature. So there are screening and testing measures in place at these ports of entry, and we are trying to sort of mitigate the risks where possible.
If you can't get off the plane, then what happens? Are you taken into isolation? What happens to you then?
I would imagine so. Our government has sort of set up, and they're working quite closely with the airports to manage this. All airport staff are equipped. They're wearing protective gear to also, protect them from any sort of risk of the virus. And so there are these measures in place, and they are sort of taking the necessary precautions, especially at our airports.
How hard will it be then to introduce control measures in a country like South Africa, where you have townships, you have informal settlements, you have a large number of people travelling on overcrowded trains, in minibus, taxis, that kind of thing? I mean, it's going to be a challenge, isn't it?
It's going to be exceptionally difficult. I mean, the president said, he encourages people to limit non-essential travel, especially domestic travel via air, rail, and taxi. But this is the form of transport that most people use, and so it is difficult. There's no way of monitoring that. There's no way of limiting it. I think what they're going to have to do is just sort of up security, or rather hygiene control measures at these transport interchanges. And that's the most we can do at this stage, because they haven't announced any sort of bans on the use of commuting by taxi or rail or bus.
And we talk about self-isolation, which is difficult but possible if you live in a house or even a flat with several bedrooms. It's possible for one member of the family to shut themselves away. In South Africa, you're talking about shared living spaces, shared by many people.
Absolutely. I mean, most people live in abject poverty, and so 4 or 5 people live in one single room. There isn't another room for them to go into. And government's going to have to look at that in terms of what then do they do to mitigate that. They are obviously now, with it being declared a national disaster, they are able to access certain resources which they wouldn't ordinarily have been able to access. This includes setting up temporary accommodation for those at risk where necessary, rapid sort of emergency systems that they're putting in place. And they are trying to identify certain areas in the different metros and districts where that can be set up. So should the need arise, they will be ready.
Leila, thank you for joining us for the update. Leila Majid there, journalist and editor at Power 98.7 talk radio station in Gauteng in South Africa.
Yeah, well, screening and testing is a big issue, as we were hearing there. And let's talk about it in the East African context now with Dr. Ahmed Kalabi, who's Chief Consultant Pathologist and Group CEO of the Lancet Group of Labs in East Africa. Tell us about how the patients have come to the attention of the authorities. Are people being caught by the measures that have been put in place in ports of entry?
Unfortunately, at the moment, all the cases that have come up were not actually picked during screening at the port of entry. If you look at the first case in Kenya, actually it was a student who passed through the immigration, went home, and 5 days later was not feeling well, and she's the one who declared herself to the authorities and then got tested. The same thing happened in Rwanda, where it was an Indian who passed through immigration, and by the way, Rwanda have a very strict screening at the thermal screening at the port and a very detailed questionnaire. But he had gone through Dubai and found himself in Rwanda and was he's the one who declared himself as having the symptoms. So, in my opinion, I don't think the screening at the airport is necessarily having a net effect in terms of grabbing the people who are actually at risk.
Right, that is concerning, isn't it? In terms of your understanding of how the virus might spread, let's say in East Africa, are there differences, do you think, of the context where you are, or would we see the same sort of thing that we've seen in China, we've seen in Italy, we might be seeing in America? Are there differences of climate, differences of culture, which might affect the spread?
Initially, people were thinking that, maybe black people don't get affected, maybe Africans have a better immunity, maybe the humidity and the warm weather will reduce the spread of the virus. But that's entirely not true, because what's happening is in countries where it is hot, like Sri Lanka, they're still getting the community spread. I think the problem was that or rather the good thing is that we do not have a lot of intense travel between ourselves and Europe for that matter. And that's why we do not have so many cases. People are focusing on China, but as we speak, we've not had a single case of infection in any of the 26 or 27 countries that came from China. Actually, all of them have come from Europe and America.
And what does that tell you?
Ironic.
See, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because obviously the seat of it, the burning origin of it was in China. What does that tell you about which measures have been effective and which haven't?
I think for the Chinese, the total lockdown in China, and what was happening was the people who were traveling out of China were actually getting thoroughly screened. And that helped quite a lot because there was a lot of alertness. But we turned a blind eye to what was happening in Europe and America. And that's why we're getting the cases from there. And when the people come here, personally, I've been saying this, I think there is already a community spread happening. If you saw, Rwanda today had 4 more cases announced by the Ministry of Health this morning, about an hour or 2 hours ago. Now, these 4 cases, out of them, one was actually a local Rwandese with no history of travel, no history of contact with any of the other people who have been identified, yet was found actually to have the virus, which means there's actually a community spread happening. The other cases were people coming from the US, from London. So this thing is actually there, and it's going to be spreading in the community if it's not happening already.
Right.
Yeah.
There is a lot of concern in European countries of the lack of ventilators. For example, Germany doesn't think it has enough. It doesn't have ventilators to loan to Italy. In Britain, the government has urged companies that make other stuff to try to start making ventilators because there aren't enough ventilators. In terms of the actual health capacity at the most serious end, where you are in East Africa, what is the picture when it comes to intensive care beds, to the availability of ventilation for people who might have extreme difficulty breathing? I mean, what are the numbers? What are we actually talking about?
It's as bleak as you can imagine. I mean, actually, I'll say it's probably non-existent. If you look at Kenya, for example, the number of hospitals with ICU beds, and I'm talking about proper functioning ICU beds, cannot even take care of the usual requirements for the usual illnesses that we have. A lot of people have to be denied going into ICU because there are just not enough beds, like for example at our Kenyatta National Hospital. I don't think we have any capacity to handle an outbreak of this nature if it was going to happen the same way it has happened in Iran or in Italy. If you go to Uganda, for example, I was reading an article that they have less than 50 ICU beds in the entire country, and most of that is in the private sector. I mean, both public and private sector, we are just not equipped for this. That's the honest truth. And that applies to everything from ICU beds to number of doctors, medical workers, to testing capacity. I don't think we just have the capacity.
Straight talking, indeed, from Dr. Ahmed Kalabi. Many, many thanks indeed. Ahmed is Chief Consultant Pathologist, Group CEO of the Lancet Group of Labs in East Africa.
Newsday BBC World Service, and of course the shutdown the coronavirus is causing across the world is affecting sports as an industry as a whole, Matthew Kenyon.
Yeah, the list of cancelled events gets longer and longer by the minute. Some cancelled, some postponed. That might be a key difference. English Premier League, the NBA, major tennis tournaments. And of course, we're looking at the European Championship and the Olympic Games, supposedly scheduled for later on this year. Let's talk to Tim Crow, who's a sports marketing consultant who's worked in the industry for a very long time. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning.
The costs of all of this are absolutely huge for everyone who's trying to organise and maintain sport over this situation. How big an impact is all this having financially?
Potentially very big. It's a giant jigsaw puzzle, really. Sport has so many different parts of its constituents, and they all need to work together, and events need to take place. So it's a very, very significant problem that everyone's trying to work through. In the case, for example, of football and the Premier League, there's a big difference between completing the season and not completing the season in terms of how all these things play out.
Yeah, is that is that the key difference? Because when it comes down to money, lawyers usually get involved. Eventually, when all this is done and dusted, everyone's going to be arguing about this, aren't they? Who made the decision? Who's responsible, and so on.
You're right. There will be a lot of people having consulted their contracts in the last little while, and so much will depend on what it says in there. And of course, if you're not able to actually complete key moments leading up to an event, for example, with the Olympics, athletes need to take part in qualifying meetings in order to qualify for the meetings. Forget the implications of actually going to Japan and the whole issue around testing and infection, if people aren't actually able to qualify for the Olympics because the events that were the qualifying events weren't able to take place, that obviously has very serious implications in its own right.
And so many sports are operating on such a narrow margin. I mean,
Yes.
this is an existential threat to the businesses themselves, as it is much more widely in the economic world.
Yes, to many of them. I mean, football clubs below the top level, for example, and many other sports who are absolutely reliant on the revenue that comes in from staging their events. Without that revenue, many of them are facing an existential threat. So that becomes a really, really big issue.
And is there an indication at the minute that people are prepared to work together to try and ameliorate the effects of this? We've heard the Italian Football Federation saying to UEFA, please cancel the European Championship so that we might have a chance of completing our league in June, July, August, if we can get back on the pitch at all then. Is that kind of cooperation going to be seen?
I'm certainly seeing it with many of the clients that I work with and their partners. I'm certainly seeing a spirit of cooperation and collaboration. People realise that these are extraordinary and certainly in our lifetimes unprecedented situations, and that it's no one's fault and that everybody needs to work together to get through it. So I'm certainly seeing that with the clients that I work with, Matthew.
Tim, thanks so much for joining us. Tim Crow, sports marketing consultant, contemplating the consequences of everything that's playing out. And clearly we don't know what those consequences will be or what size they will be yet. We only do know that they are very serious indeed. We're waiting for the Confederation of African Football, here's another example, to tell us what it's found on its inspection of Cameroon, which is due to host the African Nations Championship for locally based players next month. But given all the travel restrictions and quarantines that are being put in place across the continent in common with elsewhere in the world, it's quite hard to see how that will be able to go on unscathed. The latest in focus on Africa and sport today.
Matthew Kenyon, many thanks indeed with the sport. 13 minutes to the hour. This is Newsday.
Now, more than 2 weeks after the religious violence in Delhi, the death toll has risen to 53. Shockingly, dead bodies that had been thrown into drains are now being found. A few people are still reported missing, and hundreds of displaced Muslims are living in temporary camps, too fearful to return to their homes. For generations, people from both communities have lived together in northeast Delhi, but after the deadly violence that ripped it apart, many wonder what the future holds. Yogita Lamai reports now from that area.
Generations of Hindus and Muslims have lived as friends and neighbours in northeast Delhi. But 3 days of violence shattered decades of peace. In this working class area of India's capital, people are now living in fear and suspicion. The neighbourhood is characterised by narrow alleyways and a drain that snaked through it, littered with rubbish. Its dark, muddy water is now revealing the horrors that unfolded in February. Nearly a dozen bodies have been pulled out of it. Ruxana Banu's husband, Firoz, was found in the drain 2 weeks after the violence, burnt to death. He was a 35-year-old Muslim man. His 4 young children cling to their mother outside the ground where their father has just been buried.
Punish the people who've made me a widow. They have destroyed us. They've left my children without a father.
She also tells me she knows that the Hindu men who murdered her husband live in the same area. In both communities, there are stories of loss and brutality. Anil Pal is a shop owner. I meet him in a burnt-out parking lot that has cars owned by both Hindus and Muslims. All the vehicles are in a state of ruin. He tells me how a 20-year-old Hindu man who worked in his shop was killed by a Muslim mob. Dilbar Negi had come to Delhi to earn a living.
His body was dismembered and burnt.
कैसे जी पाएंगे लोग? अभी आसपास रहते हैं लोग,
After what you've seen, can Hindus and Muslims live together here? I asked him.
People from both communities are scared. We could never have imagined something so horrific would take place. There's no choice though. Gradually it will become all right.
But there are areas where life has not moved on. I'm in a home that was set on fire during the violence. The insides are completely charred with soot, strewn all over. I can see some kitchen vessels, a stove, all of them completely burnt out. The families living here have not yet dared to come back home. We find many of them living in a tented camp in a predominantly Muslim area. It's built on a ground that's normally used to offer prayers. In one tent, we find a man laying on a cot, both arms heavily bandaged. His name is Nizamuddin. He's too traumatized to speak. He was beaten along with his brother Jamaluddin, who didn't survive. Outside the tent, a group of men surround us, telling us what they've been through. The ripples of what happened in this Delhi neighborhood have been felt around the country. And so, I asked them a central question.
What is the Indian Muslim feeling today?
Ma'am, very, very unsafe. People are thinking that they should go to other country. They are cursing themselves, their families, that why they are born in this country. They are not safe at all.
Indian Muslims say they're staring at an uncertain future. It's a community that's questioning where it belongs. The lives that have been lost in northeast Delhi, seen as a dark turn for a secular India.
Yogita Lamai there on the divisions erupting in northeastern Delhi.
If you have something that you would really like to share regarding our entertainment news, you're quite welcome to do that, and you can do it on our social media platforms. Here at home, it is a Salma HD Radio in capital letters, and you can say the hashtag Midnight Show. I will definitely attend to it. Or if there's something that I mentioned and you're thinking, nah, I don't understand, you're more than welcome to share with me. And do not forget, for streaming, it is www.salmahdradios.co.za. Please tell the others who Sikolo Saba Putin is on radio, and I'm going to be with you until the hour of 12. And we still have many things to talk about, because we have our topic coming up in the next hour. And you do know that we do have a new segment here at home, Feel Good Moments. So I really want to hear those feel good moments where you are proud of yourself, something you did for yourself or you did for somebody else, because we do deserve to celebrate their little victories. I'm sure you're in total agreement with me as far as that is concerned. Let's go back to the music. As soon as we come back, we just go straight to our phone meetings and focus on our topic.
Overseas, a patch is a bomb. Artis Yaboyik, Artis Obale.
Realize that we need first to be able to utilize other means before they come to the facilities, particularly for those who have contacts and those who suspect that they have contracted the virus.
On the first of those two, As we speak, MEC, how much personal protective equipment do you have here in Gauteng? How big is the gap between what is required for our public health sector workers to do their work and what you have? Do you have enough personal protective equipment? And if you don't, what is the magnitude of the shortfall right now?
I think we have a bare minimum. You know, I wouldn't say that we have got the optimum levels, but we have put a call out. So there are suppliers who have indicated that they can be able to provide us with more. And that's an instruction that we have given also to our officials to make sure that we don't have to be able now to go through these bureaucratic processes. So we have to acquire them as fast as possible so that we optimize the supply. Because remember, the supply also has to be given to those who are contact tracers, you know, our community health care workers who will be on the ground going to visiting and going to the houses of the suspected patients.
Yeah. This is no time to try and deliberately be annoying or contrarian. So my apologies for pushing, but I just want to know, when you say bare minimum, do you even have an audit of how much you need and how much you have in terms of personal protective equipment for our healthcare workers? Or is that something which, as we speak, you can't even put data to it beyond just describing it as bare minimum?
I can be able to answer your question after we've had our audit thing now, so that I can have a sense in general to have what we have. But what I've given you as a response, it's a response that says that we are not satisfied with what we have, and we think we have to amass more so that we can be able to protect our healthcare workers. So that will be the point that I would say. But in terms of quantities as such and the figures, I might not be able to give you that, but I can just accept that and admit that it's not something that we are satisfied with, and we are working on optimizing the supply.
Yes, and it's extraordinary circumstances, so I've got some sympathy for you. Another question in terms of resources that many people are asking me to ask you is in relation to masks, oxygen, and also, whether or not there is enough sanitizer if patients come at the gates and they enter hospitals, respirators. Do we have enough surgical masks, gowns, aprons, eye shields, and goggles? Do we have an audit on those items?
I can only give you the figure later, but what I can say again is that we are at a bare minimum, and we've been working for the whole week last week in making sure that we amass that. Our difficulty, Eusebius, is that the most of the suppliers that give us this equipment, they import them from elsewhere. And now with the imposition and all what we are having now, it's difficult. So we are calling on those who are now locally producing, and most of the time they are producing at a minimum level that they must give us. So we are amassing, building out and opening out to everyone, even making a call to your listeners now, those who've got the capacity and who have them in store now, because the other people tell us about 4 weeks later they will be able to deliver, but we said no, we want them now because we're at that point.
Absolutely.
So we are pulling out, and I think at some point we'll have to come back to your show to tell you that this is where we are now in terms of the quantity and our satisfaction level.
And we'll do that. Yeah, we'll need to give you space to get on with the business of sourcing and auditing. The last question I wanted to ask you is, you talked about two legs. There is what needs to happen at clinics and hospitals, and then there is what might happen within the community. A related question, and then we'll end it for now. We'll check in with you every couple of days or so. The clinics, just to the clinics, MEC, are spaces that are often very confined with lots of people. There's overcrowding in the passages, small rooms. There's lots of contact opportunity for the virus to travel there. That's one concern, just the clinic as a space. The same with our hospitals, the same with the waiting areas at hospitals. Is there standard operating procedure and immediate training for how to deal in terms of the flow of patients, identifying ones to go into certain lines for immediate testing if you have certain symptoms like coughing, etc.? Or have we not even begun to work out what will be the SOPs in crowded clinics and hospitals from the gate to the waiting areas? That's the first part of the question. Secondly, if we are going to, in part, make this also an opportunity to take seriously home-based and community-based care, do we have community care workers that are trained and ready to do that?
Okay, I'll start with the second one. I think we are one of the provinces that are leading, the integration of community health care workers into the system. And currently we are sitting at 9,000 community health care workers. We will be training them on the new problem that we have of the outbreak in terms of what they are going to do and how they are going to do it. And they are going to help us to be part of the tracers that we need in terms of contact tracers. Like I said, we really need a lot of them so that we can be able to contain and know where the people are, those who are affected. The second part is that we are going to use a lot of digital outreach that will help us on both ways to protect people, allow people not to come to the facilities, but they can be able to do some of the things themselves at home. The SMS number that has been set, the 0600123456, is one of the means that we are making it available for people to do self-screening, because it's not everybody in UCBS who would just be saying that I have symptoms and I think I've got corona. There should be a way of filtering and screening, and one of them is that that's the way that there are questions that you have to go through, and if all of them are on the positive, then you are a patient that the contactors, the tracers will come to you and do the swabbing. So most of the swabbing we're hoping to do it outside the facilities than in the facilities. And the other one is the Dilo app that is downloadable on all the smartphone platforms, which also is a patient engagement app, which also gives you a sense of the self-screening questions and the symptoms. And what is the advantage with the Dilo app is that it then geolocates you when you put in your particulars and everything, so that it makes it easier for the tracers to be able to get to your point. So there are means that we are trying to do and put into place to decongest our clinics. The third part, which is the last one, is that we also want to encourage our communities that those who are coming to our facilities for non-agent cases, they shouldn't make their way now, because we won't be able to deal with them at the current moment, because we are dealing with the emergency, so that it lessens the crowd and everything. But I think this is a continuous engagement to CBS and will be available in most instances, that we just have 10 minutes of the show just to update everybody.
We appreciate that, because knowledge is key. Thank you, Dr. Masuka. We're all in this together. There's a lot of shortages, but I also think the honesty and the accuracy of your information is crucial at this time. So thank you so much for coming on.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll do that.
Thanks. That's the MEC of Health in Gauteng, Dr. Bandile Masuku. So lots of things in terms of resources that are not available, but this is no time to pretend they are available, and let's see how government gets on.
Honey, I'm taking Tando to soccer. You did pay this month, right?
When are you coming home, Danami? We need groceries.
I'm so excited for varsity. You just need to pay for res. If monthly debt repayments leave you overwhelmed and stressed, it's time to switch your bond to SA Home Loans and consolidate your expensive short-term debts into one lower monthly payment. That's one payment, less interest. Call 0860 246 810. SA Home Loans. Bond with us.
And baby is coming up on the ultrasound now. Oh, hang on a sec. It looks like babies.
Sometimes there's more to life than you planned for. Get an RCS loan of up to 250,000 Rand with interest rates from 15%. To apply, SMS 702 to 48461. RCS, powered by the BNP Paribas Group, a registered FSP. T's and C's and standard SMS rates apply.
Barney! Neighbour, what's up? I just saw a strange guy driving off with your car. Come on, let's catch him.
Oh, relax, bud. That was the oak from We Buy Cars.
You just told me yesterday you were thinking of selling your car.
I was, so I visited their website and they made me such a good offer, I had to let her go.
But what about the payment?
Got it. They came to me, did all the paperwork and made immediate payment.
Wow, that was quick.
I know, right? WeBuyCars.co.za, the easiest way to sell your car by far.
This is Eyewitness News.
Good morning, I'm Tara Penny. South Africans are mulling over government's response to the COVID-19 outbreak and are now assessing how best to cope with school closures planned for Wednesday, travel restrictions that start today, and the cancellation of mass gatherings. With the first local transmission now confirmed in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa says the situation calls for an extraordinary and urgent response. There are now 61 confirmed infections in this country. The majority are in Gauteng, the Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. Government has declared a national state of disaster, which will help empower the state to take extraordinary measures to stop the spread of the pandemic. Several travel bans have been imposed on high-risk areas abroad, which include Italy, the US, Germany and the UK. South Africans who are returning from these countries need to go for testing, quarantine or self-isolate. Ramaphosa says non-essential travel across the country must be limited and large gatherings of more than 100 people will not be allowed.
Mass celebrations of upcoming national days, such as Human Rights Day and other large government events, will be cancelled. Where small gatherings are unavoidable, organizers will need to put in place stringent measures of prevention and control.
Many are now asking what this means for people who depend on taxis and need to queue up among large numbers of commuters waiting to catch their rides. Parents are also having to scramble to make childcare arrangements, with schools closing down later on this week.
Schools will be closed from Wednesday, 18th March, and will remain closed until after the Easter weekend.
Shopping malls will also have to impose strict measures to limit the spread of the virus. COSATU, which had called for government to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, says while it appreciates some of the measures, others need to be interrogated. General Secretary Becky Nchali.
To me, as I'm speaking on this, I said the government has not said anything. It needs to be clarified exactly what needs to be done. If you feel, that's what we're going to debate it on Monday. If you're a worker, you feel that you get all these symptoms at home, what does it mean to go to a taxi, go to the clinic?
Taxi union Santaco says it'll be meeting with Health Ministers William Kize and Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula to assess how travel limitations on commuters using public transport can be handled. Santaco's president, Philip Tybosh, says the impact of the president's announcement, specifically about taxis, will have a massive impact not only on the drivers, but also on the millions of commuters who rely on this mode of transport to get to work every day.
We are definitely going to seriously look into what could be done to input in remedying this situation of the coronavirus. We are going to try by all means to spread an encourative message to all, including the taxi drivers.
Now, South Africa's rand is weakened against the dollar as the deepening coronavirus crisis roils financial markets, with the focus shifting to the Reserve Bank interest rate decision, which is due later on this week. Earlier today, the rand hit 16.47 to the dollar. It's a 1.94% weakness compared to its close on Friday. Economists are sounding the alarm over the impact the outbreak will have on the already vulnerable economy. Kevin Brunt takes a look.
The global spread of COVID-19 and the general advice to socially distance to avoid contracting and spreading the virus has already led to several major event cancellations. Over the weekend, the Two Oceans Marathon was cancelled. Before that, the Cape Town International Jazz Festival was put on hold. It's not just the events that suffer, but all the sectors that stood.
And now we interrupt this news bulletin. The latest government briefing on COVID-19 has just started in Pretoria. Let's take you straight there now, courtesy of the SABC.
Welcome to this press briefing. You will
notice that we have the full contingent of the members of what was the interministerial committee, which has now been converted into the National Command Council, chaired by President Ramaphosa. Last night, President Ramaphosa made an announcement that the COVID-19 outbreak has been declared a national disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act, and this is in recognition of its magnitude and severity in our country. Fellow South Africans, as of this morning, we have, as of yesterday, we were having 61 when the President announced. At the moment, we will talk about the 61, but I need to make you aware that we are also investigating another 4. But because of the system that we are using, we will not give you all those details right now. But amongst them are those who are being tested from private laboratories and have to be verified or validated by the National Health Laboratory Services, so that we can then be certain of the outcome. So for that reason, whilst we have 61, we will give you details of the others as soon as they are verified. And I'm only saying so because some of those are verified. You might be picking up stories about them. We just say to you, we are aware of them, but we will not announce finally until they have been verified, particularly where there have been already some media talks about them. But the numbers have increased, and the latest is that in Gauteng we've got additional 7, 33-year-old who had traveled to Spain, a 60-year-old female who had traveled to Austria, a 30-year-old male who had traveled to India, a 39-year-old who had traveled to the US, a 43-year-old female who had traveled to the US, a 50-year-old male who had traveled to France and the UK, a 37-year-old male who had traveled to the US, Dubai and Mexico. In the Western Cape, we indicate 2 right now. 39-year-old male who had traveled to Canada, a 15-year-old male who had traveled to France, and then in Limpopo, you have a 29-year-old male who had traveled to France and Netherlands. This one is interesting because after we addressed our staff to say we are having no case from China, but they are all coming from Europe, the department then referred one of its staff members who had come from Europe to go to quarantine and was asymptomatic, and then in the process got tested, and the test has come back positive, and is a doctor. So he had visited parts of France and Netherlands and had been put on self-quarantine because in discussion it became clear that he would need to consider that, and this has actually paid off. Then in Mpumalanga, we've got a 55-year-old male who had traveled to France, and again here it looks like we have here a medical professional who has also been found to be positive, but this is the case of imported case at the moment. Amongst those that we are investigating, we're trying to validate, because it appears that there may be already some who are internal transmission. So those cases of internal transmission will only be properly announced once we've got all the information, because for a start, it's not enough to just say was tested positive by a private laboratory. It has to be validated, but on top of that, we need to go into the history and try and locate the exact source of where that could have happened. In other words, we want to try and find who are they linked to. Can we find the contact that was source of that infection. So it is important, therefore, that as soon as we get that information, we'll update you in a very in a statement. Another comment about the South Africans who have come from Wuhan. We did see a lot of you had covered the story, and want to say thank you for that. As announced by President, indeed, 114 South Africans were repatriated from Wuhan. Their flight landed on Saturday, and they settled well in the Ranch Hotel in Limpopo, as we had undertaken to ensure that we take all the precautionary measures in this repatriation process. Yesterday, all these citizens were examined and were tested for COVID-19. We await the results, but our medical team has assured us that they found them to be medically fit, and as they conducted the examination on them. 2 citizens had a very slight cough, which they didn't think was significant, but didn't show any other symptoms or any temperature. And so they just took a precaution to get them isolated so that they can monitor them as we await the results. But we are not quite worried about them because we have not really had a strong history from China, and they are not showing significant symptoms, as it were. But we also wish to advise South Africans that when our citizens were boarding from Wuhan, we did medical screening at that level, and that screening was done both by South African and Chinese authorities. Of the citizens that had presented themselves for repatriation, 4 had to remain behind. This is because they displayed some symptoms. It must be highlighted, this does not mean that they have been infected, but this was just done to mitigate the risk of having anyone in the plane that could have had any form of symptoms. So we are not saying that they've got the virus, but simply saying that on the criteria for bringing them back, we kept saying to the members here that we are only going to bring those South Africans who are displaying no symptoms and no fever and have not tested positive in any way. So we want to therefore indicate that in that system, 4 had that problem, and the Department of Social Development has already been in touch with the families, and so that matter has been dealt with, as it were. Now, the other issue then, of course, what we'd like to say is that the issue around Wuhan is really the least of our concern right now. We're not worrying about them, although there was quite a bit of excitement about it. We really never thought there was a big risk associated with them. It's also important to alert our citizens that individuals with other existing medical conditions, such as chronic lung disease and immune suppression, are more vulnerable and may experience severe symptoms if infected with COVID-19. We put up together teams that are giving us all the guiding information, and they've put to us a number of papers with clear advice in terms of how we deal with this, taking into account the conduct of the disease in other countries. And tomorrow, we're going to be convening a large gathering of clinicians, virologists, epidemiologists, pulmonologists, and the whole team that are involved in the management of infectious diseases to look at tightening and coordinating our response to this particular epidemic. Approximately 15% of those who develop the disease require hospitalization. Most cases, that is about 85%, can then self-quarantine at home and can be treated, or sometimes they don't require much treatment. In this regard, the clinicians observing the patient will make the determination and advise if they view the patient as high risk and therefore requiring hospital admission or can recover from home. We've already got some people who are asking the questions, we hear so-and-so is positive, but why is he still at home? We just need to indicate that only 15% will require hospitalization, and probably 5% will end up with intensive care if that situation does not get any better. So we also want to reiterate, In terms of epidemiological evidence from affected countries, it shows that containment is possible at every early stage, and even then it's difficult, but we need to intervene at an early stage. It's difficult with that, but if you don't intervene at an early stage, then you don't have much chance. That mitigation of risks is eventually the most pragmatic response and should start early. Delayed action could overwhelm the health system. In other words, if we wait until we run into several hundreds and thousands, you're running the risk of overwhelming the health services, because you'll notice that most of the people that we're talking about right now are not requiring admission. But one or two have been in, and we've had a report that they've got other complicated diseases, as it were. But what it means is that once the number goes huge, you end up with the 15% being a large number of people. That 15% can overwhelm your services, especially because some of those on the 85% would need to still be seen on outpatient basis. So we want to make that point as a way of looking at it. It's difficult to give exact numbers about what should happen in South Africa, but we believe that with what we have seen so far, it is important for us to institute additional action. And whilst early action may be unpalatable, especially because sometimes you start the action when people don't really see the disease as being a big problem, it may actually, in other areas, affect negatively the economy or even social life and cause inconvenience. But it's actually the lightest you can do under the circumstances. So we'd like to appeal to our people to understand that even if they do not see the disease as severe, they need to know that we need to take extra steps to make sure that we prevent an escalation at that level. So we will therefore be talking a little bit about that, but just to say what it means is that we need everyone to work together. We need all of us as government to operate as a unit. We need to be united, government and civil society, business and labor, churches, traditional leaders. All of us need to be working together. We need to be working together as fellow South Africans, because this requires everyone to play their part and take responsibility to stop the spread of the infection. We do want to acknowledge some of the stakeholders who have come on board to give us assistance. For example, the NGOs who are calling to want to partner with government. We're going to be reaching out to them. We also have the private sector that has offered to assist us in a number of issues, particularly availing certain resources to assist with our mechanisms for tracking, for tracing, and monitoring facilities. It has actually been proven those countries that experience early spikes in the pandemic, these facilities have not been set up, and therefore it becomes important that we deal with those areas, as it were. In some instances, as we are looking at the response, it becomes also important for people not to view this as an issue only for government. So the private sector has also come on board in some instances to offer us accommodation to support the quarantining programs that we have spoken about next to the airports. So a number of these mechanisms, a number of these expressions of support are welcome, and want to thank the private sector for that, and want to call on more and more private sector to come in. Some of them have also contributed in various ways, in communication and also in support on the quarantine in Limpopo and so on. So our call is for private sector to come on board. Each of the ministers will give us a sense of the actions that they will be taking on their side. But let me say that when the president declares the state of national disaster, and he therefore says that we have a national command council, this is a team of ministers and senior officials in government who will meet at least 3 times a week, that will be released from some of the activities to focus on our response on the issue of the coronavirus. If one may put it in military terms, let's say all along, in the past few weeks and days, we went through what we call preparation, where we prepare for battle. Then we went through another aspect which we could call reconnaissance, where you then collect information about the size, the location, the behavior of the adversary forces. In this case, that's what we've done with the coronavirus. We have actually seen that in the past week, this is today, up to day 10, we had actually increased from 1 to 51. That was actually doubling every second day. Now that for us is not just exponential, we think it's an explosive rise in the cases that are positive. Mind you, are still dealing with imported cases, which then becomes our biggest problem because each and every one of the individual is capable of creating their own mini outbreak. They can grow into, massive numbers of who are able to deal with the contacts. The last we checked in terms of the contacts, we'll probably be approaching 1,000 contacts. It's important for us to move ahead and try and suppress the curve. So the peak must not arise quickly. It needs to take a while to actually rise and then to reduce the speed at which it is happening. So we therefore have to move to the next higher gear, and I said using the military language, we therefore need to get onto the area of hard combat. Hard combat basically means we all now have to turn ourselves into soldiers, ready to fight. When we say so, we're saying that every South African is a soldier, because each and everyone has to take responsibility to fight this infection. And it's not as simple, but it's going to be very hard. But just so that you have a sense of the lie of the land as we move into the future, we are determined to suffer as few casualties as possible. We are determined to deal with this outbreak. We're also determined to take hard decisions, if need be. And therefore, the first phase where we are, we're going to be taking decisions where we're calling for restrictions. Restrictions is the mildest form of limiting contact from person to person. The president has taken advantage, has made use of Section 36 of the Constitution. That basically says under certain circumstances, we'll have to look at what restrictions have to be imposed to help to deal with a situation which is a problem for the nation. So on that basis, this is the first step. We have to make it work within the next 2 to 3 weeks. If it works, we will see as we monitor the numbers. It means we want to see that the numbers don't increase as fast or they can be contained, but also it means that it should not spread much further than what we are already seeing. Now that is an important issue. If that does not work, we therefore need to escalate to a higher level. We're not there yet, but I think South Africans need to be aware. When we say we're talking about hard combat, it means hard decisions. When we said people must not panic, we didn't mean that we must just be complacent. We didn't mean that we must do nothing. We meant that we must be focused, we must be determined, and we must be united in our action, because only when we are united we are able to deal with this issue strongly. And any outbreak does not get defeated by officials in government or professionals in the hospital. It is a society that changes its behavior, that reduces the harm that such an outbreak would have caused. So if Section 36 restrictions that have just been utilized, utilizing the National Disaster Act, utilizing the declaration of coronavirus as a public health emergency of international concern, we need to escalate. We cannot rule out a need in the future to actually impose a state of emergency. State of emergency would basically be about tightening enforcement so that certain conduct is restricted, so that we can make sure we close the loophole that will make the virus spread. If that doesn't work, I think you'd have seen in other areas, we also might need to take another step. In this case, between now and that time, we're hoping that the testing, the treatment, all of those issues are going to be ultimately organized on a district-to-district basis so that we've got a full sense of whether in every city, in every district, what is the trend, what is the conduct, what are the numbers of people who have got the infection. And of course, where we think that the situation is getting completely out of control, we have learned from other countries, we've seen in China, we've seen in Italy, that at some point even lockdowns become necessary. So we hope not to get to all of those steps. We're simply saying we just want South Africans to be aware that when we talk about hard combat, we're talking about a number of steps that are going to require commitment and South Africans working together and being united. We need everyone to support, we need everyone to play their role, but we are also saying we've seen that coronavirus can be defeated. We've also seen that those who defeated coronavirus were united, they were determined, they worked together, they were prepared to take hard decisions. And therefore, that's the way we need to look at it. Having said so, I want to come back to say where we are. We've actually heard the President has spoken about restrictions on travel. Your Minister will be able to give you more information about that. We've spoken about having to need to increase testing on those who are returning and increase quarantine on those who are returning. We're going to be setting up our system to do that. We've spoken about the need to reduce person-to-person spread by restricting numbers of people who are in meetings. Of course, we've got the ministers who actually have got all the information, whether this is music or sports or cultural or religious and so on. They will be the ones who are going to be engaging with those stakeholders at that level. We're going to be also looking at, I'm sure the minister will be able to give you a little bit more of elaboration about restriction of visits to correctional services. We also are going to be asking that our hospitals restrict the numbers of people who are visiting the patients and also encourage them to use masks as they visit the patients in the hospitals. This is all to try and say we're dealing with this issue. At a certain point, I'm sure the ministers will be able to talk about the engagements with the transport sector. The ministers will also talk about the engagement with those in business, in the economic sector. You've got the Minister of DTI, the Minister of Small Business, the Minister of Treasury. All of them are here. They'll be able to share some of the ideas about what we're going to be doing as we move into the future. All we're calling for is that all of us need to work together, united as South Africans, to face a common adversary, which is a virus that is rampaging all over the world, but those countries and those nations that have been able to defeat it have been able to work together. We've seen the cases in South Korea where 60% of the cases that are referable for testing actually emanate from an experience of one church that actually was convened in Daegu. And so we must say that the decisions that the President and the Cabinet have not taken them lightly. It's important for us to be upfront to say it's going to be difficult, but we'll make it. We need to work together as we go through all of that. We are intensifying our testing mechanisms. We have actually said that we want to increase capacity for testing. We have asked the laboratory services to work together, the public and private. I met them on Saturday. They need to operate as one system. Doesn't matter who owns which laboratory system. At the end of the day, everything gets coordinated by the National Health Laboratory Services. This is to make sure that we've got reliable data. This is to make sure that we've got validation and our quality of technical screening and testing is not in doubt. This becomes very important to us because it's the intelligence, it's the data that tells us the conduct of the disease. We're meeting the physicians tomorrow. We also want them to operate as one team South Africa that's dealing with the issues of prevention, that's dealing with the issues of testing and issues of management of those particular patients. It's again important that we will back them up If a doctor believes that the patient must be treated at home, we leave the doctor to treat the patient at home. If the patient must be admitted, we leave the patient to be treated at that level. We're also talking to the private hospitals so that they must make available some of their facilities on demand to the government patients when necessary. We've also asked all the MECs to go into every. You remember before we had asked that to designate a number of hospitals. We spoke about 10, 11, 13 hospitals. We said no, it's no longer necessary, it's no longer enough. We now need to designate district to district. There must be facilities there. In fact, they need to look at a little bit more of dedicated centers where we'll simply refer patients so that they don't mix with those who are not having coronavirus, so that the numbers, if they increase, they must increase separately from those who have got concomitant diseases that might cause them to be compromised. So we're looking at that. We're also now looking at the high risk of internal transmission. That risk had not reached us, but we believe now it could be setting in. That's the reason why we have to actually work very hard, because the problem of our inequality of our society means that there's one area where at the moment the people who have been found to have the infection are those who had the means, resources to visit Italy, Switzerland, Canada, US. But advantage of those is that you can get them back, you can quarantine them in their homes. Once this infection begins to spread in the taxis, in the trains, in the informal settlements, it's going to create a new dynamic. That will mean that we need to create quarantine facilities. So we asked all the MECs to start looking at possibilities of creating facilities for quarantine if necessary. And you'll understand as well that when we say quarantine, it means someone might have to move from their homes. So when we talk about how we progress in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we will be we'll be looking at how all of these are panning out. And therefore, at a certain point, we will be able to make the necessary calls as to whether the current measures are enough to contain the infection. But what we are saying to all South Africans is that, led by the President and the Cabinet, we need to form a united force behind government and all the leadership in our country, because at the end of the day, this outbreak can only be defeated at the level of our communities. So issues of increasing possibilities for hand hygiene and general hygiene, ensuring that the coughing, the sneezing does not spread. Also encouraging people to spread to make sure that they keep a distance against each other. It's going to be very, very important. I'm sure at a certain point, Minister of Police will also talk to us about what they're going to be encouraging to be the situation, because it won't help us for people to drinking the whole night until the morning when we've got a situation like this. What kind of ideas we should be thinking about in pubs and some of the places, so that we must really make everybody understand that coronavirus is going to be attacking us at all levels unless we're prepared to fight and work together and strengthen the measures that the President has actually already given. We want to thank the President and the Cabinet for moving in this direction. A lot of our professionals have been calling for additional support, and we believe that this goes a long way to dealing with this particular challenge of containment, because containment is a lot more important than actually the treatment of one person who's already got the infection. The disease will burn itself out in about 2 weeks or so, but by that time, the people must be strong enough to survive the infection. And therefore, we need to reduce the numbers of people who get the infection. We've also got calls of support from the Ambassador of the United States, who have also taken our request on getting the PEPFAR. PEPFAR that's been assisting us on fighting HIV and tuberculosis, so that we can actually redirect some of the sources to increase the amount of testing. We have said testing must ultimately be escalated to a point where we should be able to do several thousand of tests in one day. We will need to do that. We also need to be targeting areas where we do surveillance testing. We have spoken about the situation of students who might be been exposed in the University of Witwatersrand. We're working with them to look at what do we do to contain the numbers of contacts and also to advise them on quarantine. People don't have the same level of risk. There are those who are high priority risk, and then there are those who are lower and intermediate kind of risk. Our teams are going to be working on that. Our universities, our schools are going to be looked at, and so the ministers are here to talk about all of that. So for today, what we're going to request is that you're going to ask questions, and all the ministers will give you information. But in the event that you didn't ask the question and the minister is aware that there is information you need to get, we'll ask the minister to answer the questions that you haven't asked. So thank you very much, colleague Minister Mthembu. If we could take the questions, and then all the ministers are here, we have the time to take you through and deal with all the issues so that you understand the details further. Thank you very much.
Eusebius Makaiser
on 702
for the curious.
Before we go to the direction, can we request those that, in fact, all departments have got DGs, Director Generals here. All other staff, can we just go out? Anybody, everybody who's not a Director General, can we all go out, please? And protocols, can you assist us with that line at the back? I don't see DGs there. I don't see DGs there. Except journalists, of course. Except those who are journalists. But those who are government staff, we are requesting you to just go up there. I know that a place has been arranged for you, colleagues. Now, the Minister of Health has directed us to then take questions that will be answered by the ministers who are gathered here. We will take that route where we will then invite questions from all of you, which will be answered by our ministers and deputy ministers who are in attendance. Colleague there, we'll start there. Of course, if I don't see you at the back, you'll have to stand up so that we are able to see you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We'll take those hands for now. We'll come to you, colleagues. Thank you very much. Can we start? At the back? Yeah. There is something that you can press that will make us to hear you.
Is that all right?
That's correct.
Minister Genevieve Quintal from the Business Day. I've got a few questions. Firstly, just a clarity from the Health Minister. When you said that you're also talking to the private hospitals to make available facilities on demand, has there been commitment from the private hospitals on that? Also, how many ICU beds are there in the public sector, in the private sector and the military? And can you call on the private sector and the military when you need more hospital beds? On education, the plan for higher education institutions, schools were told to close, but not higher education institutions. Why not? And what's the plan there? And then on transport, for the Transport Minister, what are we doing about public transport? Many people in this country have to use taxis, trains. What happens there? What are the conditions in terms of that? And then in terms of businesses, the President yesterday said no gatherings of more than 100 people. But there are some businesses who have open floor office plans with more than 100 people on the floor. When do you start telling businesses?
And we restrict the number of questions as well.
Okay, so that's my last one.
So that everybody has a chance.
That's my last one. Thank you. Sorry, Minister.
Second one. At most, maybe let's first start there. Can we agree, colleagues, that at most 2 questions? Because all people want to ask. Now, if you are going to take 10 questions, what will the others ask? Thank you very much. The next.
Minister of Health, please. CCTV China here. This is a state of disaster. There has been mention of a state of emergency as a possibility for the future. This has been a plan that has been in process more than yesterday. You have been thinking towards the inevitability of this moment. China does set an example of the extreme end of imposing stringent controls. Is that the direction we're going? Do we see China's example in this? Because Italy and parts of Europe were quite slow in addressing this virus. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Antoinette Slavert from Rapport newspaper. Can you please give us some information about the financial aid package? And then also at this stage, what happens if people don't adhere to the guidance that given by government, and how will that change when we move towards a state of emergency? Thank you.
Next.
Alex Winning from Reuters News Agency. Just to echo Antoinette's question specifically to Minister Mboweni, do we yet have a quantum for the planned amount of additional spending to come from the budget on the measures? And the second question is about the restrictions on the ports of entry. Are there also restrictions on goods entering South Africa? I.e., are we likely to see shortages for any retailers or anyone else who imports a lot of goods? Or is it just people that are being stopped from entering if they're coming from high-risk areas? Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Ministers Mareike Vermaak from AFP. Just to clarify, the President spoke about visas being annulled and stopped and stuff. Can you just clarify what happens to foreign nationals that are in the country at the moment on working visas, on travel or holiday visas? There's obviously a certain amount of anxiety amongst people that are here, whether they are going to be moved out, do they stay here, how do they renew and extend visas? Thank you.
Next.
Good morning, Criselda Lewis from SABC Television News. Just some details on basic education. What happens to the program, the school program going forward? Is there anything in place currently to have a catch-up program of some sort? Higher education, if the Minister can please share some details on that. I know graduations at the University of Johannesburg, at Wits, classes there also affected. And do we have any commitment on the churches, for example? We're heading towards the Easter weekend. Is there any commitment from the churches, including the ZCC, for example, not to have the congregants go ahead with Mass?
Were you the last one?
Good morning. No, sir, I'm the last one. It's Govan. Okay. There's 2 more hands here, sir.
Okay.
It's Govan here from ENCA. The Minister of Health, could you please confirm which part of the country you suspect the local transmission occurred at? Secondly, considering the rate of travel and diplomatic nature of the work, can you confirm if the cabinet has been tested for coronavirus? And then lastly, with the issue of taxis, sir, will the government be setting up any disinfectant sites at the taxi ranks around the country? And what is your plan for the passing around of money in taxis, which has been found to carry the contagion? Thank you.
Next one. My hope is the last one.
Hi, Minister. Atandua here from the Mail and Guardian. 2 questions. The Minister briefly spoke about combating hard combat that we have to go into, but I wanted to find out what are the exact skills, and are you guys speaking to community leaders, traditional leaders in high density areas? Because once we hit 100 cases, the growth is beyond just drastic. We've seen in other countries. So I just asking a specific question in communicating to traditional leaders what has been done in that aspect. And secondly, about bed capacity, specifically ICU beds, because even though we have specific hospitals and places, as you said, once people get critically ill, 15% of those people will need ICU beds. Do we have enough? How many specifically do we have? How many mechanical ventilations do we have? And how many ICU beds are actually free in private hospitals, in public hospitals, and all other hospitals? Thank you.
Colleagues, you can answer from where you are. because the system is able to satisfy us answering from where we are seated instead of coming here. We will start with you, Minister of Health.
I thought you would allow the colleagues to come through.
Okay. And anyone who wants to start? Higher education.
Oh, okay. Thanks, colleague Minister Mthembu. On higher education, I just wish to highlight in the light of the questions that have been asked that firstly, what we've done, we have established a COVID-19 team which comprises of the representatives of vice chancellors and college principals, as well as our higher health system and health experts that we've drawn together. I also want to say that I'm aware that events on the ground are moving very fast, and various institutions are making contingency arrangements based on their own situation. But we have agreed on the following, that firstly, we will have to meet with the sector tomorrow morning to actually look at a comprehensive way forward on the situation. But let me highlight what we have agreed upon in the light of what the President had said and the other work that we've been doing. Firstly, we have said that contact in institutions must be limited. In terms of various institutions, only University of Cape Town has actually closed the university by bringing forward the Easter holiday break. What the other institutions like University of Johannesburg Rhodes have done, have suspended contact lectures. And we are encouraging that all institutions should immediately suspend all contact lectures as well as minimize contact among students. But we are not as yet planning a shutdown, because there are pros and cons to actually shutting down the institutions completely. Where do you take the students to? Moving them out of the residencies, and how do we deal with that? That's a matter that we will discuss tomorrow as to whether the situation does warrant the shutting down. As of now, most institutions have said, we've agreed, they will limit contact, suspend lectures, use online more, and then manage the situation of students in the residences such that we minimize contacts and we are in better control of the situation. What I also need to say, Minister Mthembu, very quickly, that the guidelines that we have agreed upon is that all major gatherings must be cancelled or postponed, like graduation ceremonies, major sports events, in line with the direction from the President. So is all international travel that must also be cancelled and be postponed, and use alternative means of carrying out those that are most important, like using technology. And all individuals who have traveled from outside the country, when they come back, they will be tested, and where there is necessity for quarantine, we've asked the institutions working with the Department of Health to do so. And also every institution we've agreed must develop a communication strategy. And all student health clinics are working very closely with the Department of Health to ensure that we are able to manage the virus better, working also with the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. Let me just end by just specifically highlighting the two institutions which have had people actually testing positively with the virus. Wits University, to begin with. Wits has been in discussion with ourselves and the Department of Health on the protocols, and the students who have gotten in touch with those who have tested positively have actually been put under quarantine. and to self-isolate at least for 2 weeks. And we are continuing to engage with WITS and the Department of Health on this scope. The University of Cape Town has also reported its first confirmed case of the virus. And in this instance, it's a lecturer who had tested positive, and the institution at Mays has made a decision that in the interest of its staff and students, and in the light of the President's statement last night, is bringing its vacation forward by a week. And the students have been asked to leave the residences within 72 hours from yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you. Since we're speaking education, let's continue with basic education.
No, thank you very much, Chair. Chair, in terms of the basic education, we had a teleconference with all provinces this morning to look at the implications of the President's announcement. So all provinces were represented in the teleconference, and we estimated that we will be losing 10 days because it's 2 days this week and it's a week after the vacations. And we've agreed that I will give a notice where we formally give a notice of the change of the school calendar, which will mean that in June we reduce our June holidays and then again take other 3 days in September, so it makes up for the 10. So that's how we felt we should deal with the 10. But in the meantime, we felt that it gives us a very good break, long time to do things that sometimes we're unable to do, like intensifying some of our programs which don't require physical context, like the Read to Lead campaign. So heads of departments are going to be changing notes today, and by Wednesday we'll be able to say what needs to happen. We've also sent notice to schools that they should, as I say, taking advantage of the long break than anticipated, that schools must give children more worksheets to work with families, to give them their books, because normally schools keep the workbooks at schools. So those are the arrangements which are done school by school to make sure that children go with lots of work at home and appeal to committees and homes to assist them. But basically, formally, the way we hope to make up for the lost day is to extend the school days. If we go beyond 10 days, we might extend the year even with a week longer, just to make sure that we cover the curriculum. So that's what we agreed as MECs this morning. But as I say, heads of department are going to also interact amongst themselves and will be able to give further details if need be. But that's what we agreed on this morning. That we'll be announcing that schools are formally closing tomorrow and they'll reopen on the 14th unless there's any other notification or information.
Minister Mteto.
Thank you, Chairperson. You would realize that the sector, sports, arts and culture, is going to be the hard hit with the measures we are taking because it thrives on the majority of people attending. So the limitation would have a very big impact, -1, on the livelihood of the sector itself. Therefore, going forward, the engagement with the private sector, the President and Minister Mkhize has outlined, becomes very important here. Already, the sector has started voluntarily on their own to take some measures, some of them. Some have gone to an extent of ensuring the awareness on the COVID-19 amongst players. If you take PSL, for instance, they've been doing that. We are going to be meeting both the sporting bodies and arts, culture and culture sector tomorrow to devise means of responding to what we are faced with and beyond, as I said, as it relates to the livelihood of the artists, of athletes, and so on and so forth. So that's where we are. In terms of the regulation in addition to the national disaster and health regulations, the Safety at Sports and Recreation Events Act is going to be helpful also to ensure that everything is done within the regulation and the act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Mabona.
Thank you very much, Minister Mtembo, and thank you, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen of the media. There was a question about possibility of using military hospitals and private clinics. I can attest to the fact that we've issued a directive that all military hospitals should have isolation areas. So we will be able to cater for our people, but also if there is a need, the Department of Health may direct some of the people to some of the hospitals we are running. The second matter, we are looking at cancelling some of the major events which were planned by the defense industry in the country. Consultation is underway with the defense industry itself. I'm sure you'll recall that every second year we have what is called the Africa Aero Defense Space Exhibition, which is held in September at the Waterkloof base in Pretoria. It's a huge gathering of people, usually brings more than 100 defense industry companies from all over the world. And we are now in the process of consultation about that, because we have to shut down, because there is no guarantee that by September this epidemic shall have, this wave shall have passed. We've also, like the directive which was issued yesterday by Cabinet, we've cancelled all travels from within the defense sector, not as an industry, as in members of the defense force. We've given a directive that all our bases, because you'll recall that we have big numbers in our bases, sometimes over 1,000. If you look at area like Oldson, for instance, where we train our army, that's a huge base, and we've given instruction that there should be scans in all the bases, at the entrance of all the bases of the defense force, but also we should supply sanitizers. Of course, we are also encouraging self-quarantine, that once people feel unwell, they should subject themselves. People should take responsibility. It's not going to be easy to go around looking for people who are not well. It is a person, the onus is on the individual to come forward and make himself or herself available for a test. Thank you. I think those are the only issues for me.
Minister Pandam, if there's any question for you, none is it.
I think there was, except that I'm not aware of Cabinet being tested. At this time, most international conferences have been cancelled or postponed, and thus there has been a fairly insignificant travel, even from a department such as ours, which has a lot of international commitments. There's a significant reduction with respect to international meetings. The visa issue, I think Minister Motsoaledi will speak to it, but I don't think there's a focus on persons who are already in South Africa, except with respect to the past 20 days, but we'll rely on him to respond on that one. Thank you, Mr. Temple.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, colleague. Well, I suppose the fundamental question that you're asking about is, at the end of the day, most of the activities have to be paid for. So where's the money going to come from? I suppose that's what you're going to ask. But before I answer that, let me just elaborate a bit about the structural arrangements being made. As you heard the Minister of Health saying that he was using a military analogy. So in the first place, the National Treasury has to be organized itself. To that extent, they already have a National Treasury coordinating working group inside the National Treasury, which is chaired by one of the Deputy Director General. They meet as regularly as they deem fit. It's first place. Secondly, a structural arrangement between the National Treasury and the Department of Health, National Department of Health. Again, they communicate regularly and meet as when they need to. Thirdly, the Minister of Finance and the MECs of Finance will coordinate whatever needs to be coordinated financially. And the MECs of Finance will coordinate with the MECs of Health in the provinces, who in turn are obviously coordinating with the Minister of Health. So this is a structural arrangement in place to make sure that we are coordinated, we are organized, and we are not haphazard, and we are not Bakununist, Bakunin. So now the financing. We stand ready to do two things. One, there are funds available within the National Disaster Funds, which will be immediately available. I don't want to mention amounts in case prices begin to change. But funds have been set aside. That's the first thing. Secondly, as the situation develops, we will need to set aside further funding. That means we'll have to reduce programs throughout the government system by reducing the allocated amounts so that we can shift these funds towards this project, which we are all committed to achieving. Finally, two things. The National Treasury officials are also in contact with the financial sector regulatory authorities, which report to the Minister of Finance, in order to make sure that we have a coordinated approach as well as far as the banking and financial services sector is concerned. I think that's all that I can say for now. But let me indicate the key issue, the Minister of Health will come back to about this, is to make sure that we should not have a situation where we say we are unable to procure testing facilities or whatever is necessary. That's an urgent issue. So I'm happy that Minister Mthethwa is willing to suspend some of his activities so I can take some money from that and give it to the Minister of Health. Thank you very much.
Minister Dlamini-Zuma.
Thank you very much. From our side, the first priority now, which we started last night, was to do the regulations that will guide this national disaster. And I can say that those will be ready today. And the second thing is we will then have to communicate with our stakeholders, which are quite broad. That will include the provincial governments, including the COGTAs in the province, the municipalities, SALGA, traditional leaders, and the rest of civil society. The provincial governments, we are planning to have a teleconference as soon as the regulations are ready, so that they are on board and they can communicate with the municipalities. We will meet the stakeholders at various levels, but we also have to deal with them. We are in contact with the IEC because the announcements have huge implications for the IEC, especially with the by-elections that were which were supposed to take place this week. Some are supposed to take place next month, and it means the way we deal with elections has to totally change. So we are now in touch with them, and they may have to be in touch with the courts to allow the courts to extend the 90 days so that we can look at how we reorganize how we conduct elections. Because elections, as you know, involves a lot of physical contact. You touch ballot papers, you give them to the voter touches the ballot paper, you take the ballot paper, you give it back to the official. Then at some stage all the ballot papers are touched, being counted. So we need to just look at how we reorganize that. So we may have to postpone some of the elections so that we reorganize. And of course also at the polling stations, normally political parties bring their people besides the voters. So there is usually far more than 100 people at every polling station. So all those things now will have to be looked at differently. And of course, in the communities, it means the functions in the communities, the municipalities must help us, and the ward councillors and so on, to make sure that the gatherings are not huge gatherings that take place. Also, we need to look at how we tweak the way of doing the IDPs, because some of the meetings are big, so we may have to fragment them. So there are lots of things, implications for our sector. And of course, we also, as a department, will cancel the travel, international travel, and even minimize the national travel.
No, live, transform. This is 702. This is 702. For the curious.
12 minutes after 11 o'clock, and this is the Eusebius McKaiser show. And of course, the most important story that we are all watching as citizens and the media is following on from the statement delivered last night by President Cyril Ramaphosa to the nation, an incredibly wide and detailed set of responses to the COVID-19 challenge that the world faces, but in particular how it is playing out now here in South Africa, where we have at least 61 confirmed cases, and that number can increase, likely to increase. And that's a number that is increasing, and we keep getting information on a daily basis from Dr. Zweli Mkhize and the Department of Health, working, of course, with the necessary statutory and other government agencies, including the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, to keep tabs on the movement of this global pandemic in terms of how it is playing out in the South African population. I think the President did well last night. If you've just joined me, my own opinion as a political analyst, as a broadcaster, as a citizen, which I had shared at 9 o'clock, is that while there are some details missing in terms of how do we cascade down the macro level description that the President had shared for what must be done immediately now that a national disaster had been declared, the particularities is precisely what the press conference that you are currently hearing is all about. So the ministers are fielding some excellent questions from my colleagues in the media, practical things, how many beds are available, ICU, equipment, what will happen in terms of the readiness and preparedness at hospitals and clinics, including in the private sector. Are monies available? You heard the Minister of Finance there talking about where he will now have to find money. The budget that we have all been talking about, that for all intents and purposes, quite frankly, can be torn into pieces because we now have to rejig this thing to speak to this unexpected historical moment in terms of a unique public health crisis the world and therefore our country happens to be facing. So it's all happening. Make sure you keep listening to EWN News Bulletins. We will continue to bring you accurate coverage of the information. And on this show and my colleague's show, also all the necessary spokespeople and the decision makers in business, in government and state, civil society organizations. And the most important message I have, if you take nothing else away from the show today, is we cannot behave as if the government are a bunch of individuals in debonair suits coming to knock at your door with solutions. The state has enormous capacity and power in terms of lawmaking, emergency acts that can be activated, and therefore it cannot run away from that legal and moral responsibility to do maximally what it can. But it is so crucial that you and I, as active, responsible citizens, are part of the solution. And so in addition to asking and critiquing the state for what it's doing or not doing, it is equally important to ask, what can I do as a CEO? What can I do as a line manager? What can I do as a mom, as a dad? What can I do as a middle-class citizen? And there's a hell of a lot more that you and I need to unpack in terms of what we can do instead of only critiquing the state. It's no time for ideological, political brinkmanship, and it's no time for being contrarian. We all have got to behave like stakeholders that need to cooperate across our differences. We're going to take a break, and then on the other side of this, I'm going to be speaking to the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches. We are a country where there are millions of South Africans who care deeply about not just their faiths, but particularly being in communion with one another. A practical implication of that is that many of you on a daily, weekly basis meet in groups of 100 or more to worship. That is incompatible with what was announced last night by the President in terms of containment strategy. What are the implications for churches, for mosques, and in particular with the Easter weekend that is arriving, when many of you might otherwise have celebrated in large numbers? And I'm going to be speaking to the General Secretary of the SA Council of Churches to get their leadership guidance on this question.
Live Podcast presents History for the Future. Lessons from a Rivonia trialist. This is the story of Andrew Mlange.
When she came out, she shouted, "Papa, Papa, Papa." Went back into the house, told her mother.
History for the Future. Lessons from a Rivonia trialist is presented by Live Podcasts. For more of great radio and podcast content, visit livepodcasts.fm.
This Wednesday, Arale Executive Mayor Councillor Mzwandile Masina will deliver the State of the City address. It is happening at the O.R. Tambo Government Precinct Civic Centre, Germiston New Council Chamber at 10 a.m. Arale Executive Mayor Councillor Mzwandile Masina will address key objectives and deliverables for the year ahead, highlight achievements from the past year, flag challenges, and outline interventions that will unlock development plans for the coming financial year. Tune in to your local stations and City of Ekurhuleni social media pages for live streams and broadcasts.
And baby is coming up on the ultrasound now. Oh, hang on a sec. It looks like babies.
Sometimes there's more to life than you planned for. Get an RCS loan of up to 250,000 Rand with interest rates from 15%. To apply, SMS 702 to 48461. RCS, powered by the BNP Paribas Group, a registered FSP. T's and C's and standard SMS rates apply.
Craftsmanship comes to life in the Mazda CX-5 2-liter active manual. At
at only 4,999 per month. It's an offer as effortless as the drive at 7.97% interest over 72 months, 10% deposit. Total cost 503,826. Balloon 143,990. Monthly service fee 69 Rand. T's and C's apply. Finance subject to credit approval. Master Finance is a product of Westbank, a division of First Rand Bank Limited, an authorized financial services and registered credit provider.
Carbohydrates, a lot of processed sugar, not enough sleep, and a lot of stress. Those things are things that down-regulate your immune system. So start eating whole foods, fresh foods, and I must say, I know everyone always talks about how expensive everything is. The expense of actually contracting something that puts you out of is a lot more expensive or lands you in hospital. So to really invest in your health is really, really important. I think this thing around, food is expensive or supplements are expensive, very true and accurate statements in some instances, but the cost of eating a whole lot of junk and a high-processed sugar diet lands you up in a state that you need to pay for your health one way or the other. So it's already time to invest in your health, get adequate sleep, try and find ways to manage your stress levels, get, all the sugar processed with carbohydrates. Definitely take vitamin D supplements and vitamin C, but those two supplements aren't expensive at all. So rather do that than buying, a whole lot of processed foods and, all of that. So that is my recommendation, and there's a direct link between what you eat and your state of health, 100%.
Processed food is everyday food that a lot of South Africans have on a daily basis. This we're talking, when it comes to carbohydrates, we're talking bread, we're talking flour, really, in a lot of ways. We're talking the sugar that we find in our cool drinks and all of that. So essentially, you cut down on those, you improve your chances.
Okay, so you shouldn't be drinking cool drinks anyway, whether there's
Corona or not. Yes.
So yes, you shouldn't be drinking cool drinks. So, your oats, your beans, your legumes, frozen vegetables, fresh fruit from the market, those are very affordable foods. Some rice. We don't have to eat, everything that we eat has to taste like a dessert. So focus on having foods. And also, there's a lot you can make yourself. And you can pre-make food and have it ready in your freezer. As I mentioned, beans and rice. Most of South America who live hardly anything like South Africans, they cook rice and beans and legumes. They get fruit that's available at markets that's well priced. Those kind of things. We don't have to stuff ourselves with bread that's highly processed or sugar or cool drinks. No one should be buying cool drinks.
Vanessa, give me 1 second. I want to cross to an ad break. We'll come back and conclude in 1 minute. Thank you.
Oh, darling, I can't believe you brought me to Paris for our anniversary. Oh, fine food, great wines, and you. It's
it is just this that makes it absolutely essential. We will live and survive together, or we will die together. And therefore, let's put our heads together, put our energies together, and make this work for all of us. And this can only be done by being compliant with a common and singular set of ideals.
That's absolutely true. And it's been great to see one or two political parties responding, again, not with brinkmanship, but also we are very obsessed quite often, and for good reason. So obsession is maybe an unfair word, Bishop, with being state-centric in our analyses. But it's a time when we also need to think of ourselves as non-state state actors, whether we're talking business, civil society organizations, the church that we'll come to in a moment, and us as individual citizens. Can you also just speak into that for me? We can't let the state off the hook, but the state is not the only actor in society, is it?
Not at all. In fact, we take the view that the state is actually is corporate RSA, is all of the citizens. It is legally is organized in a corporate sense. and that the government is only a manager employed by the state, so to say, by all of us. And as I would like to look at it this way, that if you employ a judge or any mechanic, and you don't tell them what you want to be done on anything that you're working on, if you don't tell them, you don't take responsibility what should be done, then you can't, then you cannot afford responsibility.
Absolutely.
And therefore, it is not this business of saving South African lives is not the government's baby. It's society's baby. It's easier, all of us as a society have a responsibility to make sure that we do the right thing, and that's what we're trying to do.
Now, when it comes to church, the church is interesting because when we go through anxiety, quite apart from our ordinary cultural and religious practices and identities, the church is often an important refuge when people are ill, when people feel like they need a sense of community as a respite from anxieties that they are experiencing, including a crisis like the existential one we are going through. But then the president tells us from an epidemiological
is some immutable property of the virus. But actually, a bigger determinant of the transmissibility of the virus is the behavior of the population that the virus is afflicting. So specifically, the Chinese were able to reduce the spread of the virus by changing the behavior of the humans.
The mistake of the Chinese authorities was to ignore the problem at the start, an error which certainly cost it dear. However, it was then able to capitalise on its authoritarian style of government.
I'm not saying that this is a model that should be implemented or that can be implemented in other countries. It's clear that the collectivist culture and authoritarian government of China makes it possible to do this. But the fact that this much effort was required to stop the epidemic in that country should give us a sense of the opponent we are dealing with.
It may ultimately prove impossible to eradicate the virus completely, but Professor Christakis says it is within our reach to reduce the number of cases at any one time, thereby easing the burden on our health services.
We need to reduce the force of the epidemic. We need to do something known as flatten the curve. So, for example, if we are to have 1 million cases in the United States over the course of the epidemic, we don't want them all to occur in 1 month. We want to space them out over 6 months, so that any given time, our healthcare system and our supply chain can cope with the burden of caring for those sick individuals.
Professor Christakis says we need to try to keep away from the doctor's surgery, follow the Chinese example of getting more of our healthcare online, and fundamentally change our social behaviour. No shaking hands, unnecessary meetings, more working from home, and the shutting of schools. The consequences of not acting quickly and decisively have been demonstrated not just in China, but now in a number of other nations.
If you look at what's happening in Italy, it's very alarming. I have been reading accounts that they have been resorting to battlefield triage. You know, if you're older than 60 and you have pneumonia from the virus, you don't get a respirator, you just die. They don't have enough ICU beds and respirators to meet the need. Really what we want to do is we want to convert this tsunami into a slow-moving tide that allow our healthcare systems and the broader society to do its job.
China has managed to turn the tide of coronavirus infections by imposing huge restrictions on the movement of its people and sanctioning a vast deployment of resources to screen suspected cases. It's not alone in responding to the epidemic with dramatic measures. South Korea has used mass testing to curb the disease spreading. There are lessons to learn from draconian techniques. Other countries may struggle to replicate them, but it is apparent that speed is essential. It's also painfully clear that it will take some years to emerge from the shadow of COVID-19.
The inquiry was presented by Tanya Beckett. The producer was John Murphy.
This is the BBC World Service.
Life changes.
Life is full of obstacles.
During my trip, I knew that I was risking my life going, just like I was risking my life staying back home.
But it's how we deal with those obstacles that defines us.
I learn the language intensively, sometimes in courses, sometimes alone.
It makes us.
Refugees in class is, for our school, it makes the class richer.
It breaks us.
I can't forget that nice life that we lived.
It frees us.
Our grandmothers used to get married at 12, 14, but now a 14-year-old needs to be in school.
And changes us forever.
Now I have a place where I can start all over and have a safe life.
I feel like our generation is more realizing that the way things have been going are not the correct ways.
Life Changes, a season of inspiring and thought-provoking stories. Starts March 28th.
Ahead on the BBC World Service, it's Boston Calling with me, Marco Werman. The coronavirus crisis is now officially a pandemic.
From a public health standpoint, this is a serious emergency.
It's really scary. I don't want to bring my kids outside.
You think you will be only playing, or is there anything else you'll be doing in your time?
Yes, watching TV.
The world reacts to the growing coronavirus outbreak. On Boston Calling after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Fears about the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic have led to warnings about a recession and sharp falls on European markets, despite concerted action by central banks and a drastic interest rate cut in the US. Leading European indices have dropped by more than 7%. The EU's Internal Market Commissioner described the situation as a war against the virus and said he was expecting the bloc's economy to shrink by more than 2% this year. The head of France's health service has described the outbreak as very worrying, with the situation deteriorating fast. He said people needed to respect measures brought in to try to curb the spread of the virus, which has killed more than 120 people in France. Elsewhere, Germany closed its border with 5 other countries to all but returning citizens and commercial traffic. The Italian Prime Minister said the damage from the pandemic would be serious and widespread, and a European plan for reconstruction would be needed. Many states and cities across America have taken aggressive measures, with New York and Los Angeles both ordering restaurants, bars and cafes to close their doors. Schools have closed in New York City and in some states. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have recommended against holding any gathering of 50 or more people across the US for the next 8 weeks. Strict measures are also coming into effect in numerous African countries, at least 26 of which have reported infections. Kenya has ordered schools to remain closed today and will block the entry to all non-nationals without a residence permit who come from countries affected by the coronavirus. Ghana is introducing similar measures on Tuesday, as is South Africa, which has declared a state of disaster and is closing its borders and schools. BBC News.
Hello from Boston, I'm Marco Werman, and this is Boston Calling from the BBC. It's a program that puts a global perspective on the American experience. It is great to be with you, as always. This week, the world's experience is now the American experience. Our theme today, pandemic.
From a public health standpoint, this is a serious emergency.
It's really scary. I don't want to bring my kids outside.
We may need more respirators. We may need more infrastructure than we have at the moment.
You think you will be only playing, or is there anything else you'll be doing in your time?
Yes, watching TV.
At least one glass half full perspective there on being quarantined due to the current coronavirus outbreak. But for many of us, there remains a lot of fear and uncertainty. It is now officially a pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. with confirmed cases in more than 100 countries. As of this weekend, the U.S. has banned travelers from most of the European Union. Still, the WHO is stressing the virus is not out of control. The organization's head is Tedros Ghebreyesus.
We cannot say this loudly enough, or clearly enough, or often enough. All countries can still change the course of this pandemic.
Jane Halton has worked on pandemic planning. She's a former chair of the executive board of the WHO and a former health secretary in Australia. In December, Halton was part of a study with Johns Hopkins University that gamed out responses to a global virus threat.
It would seem eerily prescient at one level, but in truth, of course, we do understand in the broad terms how these events pan out. We understand that if you don't manage to control spread early, the impact is greater.
So what does containing the disease actually mean?
Well, containment of the disease means you actually control and limit its spread. In other words, it doesn't spread to all corners of the globe. And it is still the case, if you look geographically, what you try to do is eliminate that virus in that community. You don't let it run its natural course, which would be, of course, a much higher attack rate. Many more people would get it than if you managed to contain it. I mean, I think all people who work in public health would hope that we could contain and therefore minimise the impact of this disease. But it's a big task, and I don't think any of us should underestimate how difficult that task is.
In these gamed out scenarios, though, how does coronavirus end, or the imaginary virus that you were using?
Well, in the gamed out scenarios, I mean, essentially you end up with many hundreds of thousands of people who have died. And in that scenario, the numbers that you care about are, 1, how many people get the disease, 2, how many of them are seriously ill, and then also what is the death rate. So obviously a death rate of, say, 1% on a disease which doesn't impact very many people is not going to result in many deaths, and also is not going to result in your health system being overwhelmed by all the people who need intensive care or ventilation at the one time. If, however, you have a huge number of people, say 30% of the population would get this virus, then you end up with many more people needing hospital care, and most countries don't have idle hospital care available, idle intensive care available, and so therefore you end up with many more deaths. And in that scenario, as is the case with all diseases eventually, the scenario that we gamed in New York, eventually that came to an end, and ultimately, of course, you end up with pharmaceutical interventions. By that I mean treatments and a vaccine, and so you can then bring it under control. But it is undoubtedly the case that you end up with many, many, many deaths, and depending on the level of spread with this disease, that is the risk that we're all confronting.
And what comes after containment itself?
You try to minimise the impact. You're actually trying to buy the time to actually develop the vaccine 12 to 18 months. And the thing we need to remember, even when we get that vaccine developed, we have to produce it. And we have to actually think about where the priority is for the vaccine. So post-containment is, we hope, a world where we do have pharmaceutical interventions and other treatments available. Because these diseases will continue to circulate, we all know that. Once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't get it back in, but we need to be in a position where we can manage it much more effectively.
Are you implying that COVID-19 is here forever? It's here to stay?
It will be surprising if we ever completely eliminate this virus.
Finally, Jane Halton, if you don't mind me asking, how have you prepared for yourself, for your family? Are you doing any flying?
No, I will concede that I am not flying, and I'm pretty much grounded in Australia until the bulk of this passes. I mean, there's two reasons for that, and not necessarily that I have a particular personal concern about my own safety, but I'm also worried about the notion of one being stuck somewhere, but also the impact that I might have if I pass the disease on to somebody who is very vulnerable. And we know, particularly for older people and people with comorbidities, other diseases and illnesses that make them vulnerable if they become ill. And I think everyone's got a responsibility not just to think about themselves, but also other people in the community and their loved ones.
Jane Halton, former chair of the World Health Organization's Executive Board, thank you very much.
It was a complete pleasure. Thank you.
As Jane pointed out, containment is key. And across the globe, people are trying hard to follow the best medical advice. So here's a random question. When did you last rub your eyes? Or put your hand to your chin? Well, whenever it was, stop it now. Health officials have been saying for weeks, do not touch your face. But as our own Rupa Shenoy reports, that is easier said than done.
The person you're most likely to get coronavirus from is yourself. More specifically, your hands. Think of them as sponges, soaking up the world and putting it in your eyes and mouth when you touch your face, because you probably touch it all the time. Turns out there's a likely reason why.
Social anxiety.
Psychologist Kevin Chapman, director of the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, says face touching is often a way to comfort ourselves, but it's not actually good for us.
Although I'll feel better, it ultimately reinforces strong emotional states. So yes, it can be self-soothing, but it also can backfire and make strong emotions worse long term.
Like any good, bad habit, it's hard to stop. And Chapman says all the talk about not touching faces will just make us all want to touch our face.
Having a more flexible thought related to face touching, such as waking up and saying something along the lines of, I will be more aware of touching my face today, is a much more flexible, way less punitive way to extinguish that behavior.
Some people have been able to do it.
And I haven't touched my face in weeks. In weeks. I miss it.
Others struggle. Even Singapore's Minister of Health, Gan Kim Yong.
Even at a meeting we have on this ministry task force, while I was speaking, I was touching my face. Until Minister Lawrence Wong nudged me with his elbow and said, stop touching your face.
It's possible people in some cultures might have an easier time stopping than others. Vladimir Alonso is a global health researcher with the University of Sao Paulo, who's contrasted face-touching habits in Brazil and the U.S. And he says he hasn't observed a big difference. Everyone seems to do it, almost constantly. But he says some cultures are more touch-oriented in general than others, maybe making the face-touching in those places more dangerous.
Mediterranean people, they, like to greet each other very warmly. So I think that until we have a crisis going on, people keep doing that, saying hello and kissing and hugging and all of that.
Italy's special commissioner for coronavirus has suggested Italians need to tone down their warm culture. France's minister went further, advising people to stop greeting each other with kisses. When German Chancellor Angela Merkel swept into a meeting and offered her hand for a shake to the German Interior Minister, he waved her away. Normally, that would be rude. These days, it gets a laugh. Online videos demonstrate other alternatives to handshaking, like touching feet or bumping elbows. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said people should take a cue from India and greet each other by putting their palms together and saying namaste. Vladimir Alonso of the University of Sao Paulo says that's good advice, but people should remember they're still touching lots of surfaces that other people have touched after they touched their faces. So he says the best we can hope for now
some of that
is just to
can
get
be dealt
people
with,
thinking about what they do with their hands.
If we can change some habits that we have, it will be fine. It's going to help.
It might mean we'll be a little more prepared when the next big pandemic sweeps the globe.
Rupa Shenoy reporting there. When I speak with people around the world about COVID-19, I get a range of reactions, from fear and panic to a blasé, it's nothing kind of attitude. So what's the correct response? I put that question to Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. He was a health policy advisor in the Obama White House.
Depends whether you're a public health expert worrying about the overall public health, or you're an individual trying to figure out the individual situation. So if you think about it from an individual standpoint, the risks are low. We know that the numbers we're seeing everywhere in the world are probably significant underestimates, because there's a lot of either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic people who we haven't tested. But nonetheless, from any individual standpoint, it's kind of like having the flu around. You don't really change your life that much because of the flu. On the other hand, if you're a public health expert, there are lots of things to worry about.
What is the correct response if you're a public health official? What's the difference?
Well, public health officials are looking at the whole population. And, if you look at flu in the United States, that's like 55,000 deaths. And we know that this coronavirus infection probably has a slightly higher death rate, although we can't be sure. But if this virus spreads to millions of people, that adds up. We may need more respirators. We may need more infrastructure than we have at the moment. So from a public health standpoint, this is a serious emergency. From an individual standpoint, it should change your behavior in a good way. You should wash your hands more, keep your hands out of your face more. But whether it should change your behavior, assuming you're relatively healthy, etc., that I think is a separate question.
Why is public trust in their public officials so important at a moment like this?
Well, they're going to have to guide you as to what the right behaviors are. And you have to trust them that they're giving you valid information. If they're closing down a school, you have to trust them that that's okay. If they reopen the school and say it's safe, you have to trust them that that's okay to send your kids to school. So I think having the public follow what they're being told to do is, I think, very, very important, and not to panic. I mean, we have already seen some of the economic consequences, people boycotting Chinese restaurants as if, this virus is, hanging out in Chinese restaurants, which is totally false, yet can have devastating consequences for people without any factual basis. So I think understanding what's actually happening and being able to rely on your public officials is important.
Yeah, don't panic. That's a tough one to kind of have realized. How do you build public trust? Like, what experiences did you have in the Obama administration with this sort of thing?
You have to acknowledge it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. Because of more testing, we're going to see a big increase in the number of cases. We may see a big increase in the number of deaths, unfortunately. So you just have to acknowledge to people, here are the data, here's why it's happening. Second, you have to give people, we're on top of this. Here are the 5 things we're doing. We are going to make sure there's no drug shortages, so we're working with the drug companies to get the raw materials. We are going to make sure there's no shortage of personal protective equipment. We're going to make sure that, we have hospital surge capacity in the areas that we have. We're going to let you know what we're doing and give you reliable information. And we're not going to sugarcoat things, because in the long run, which may be just a week, people are going to find out, there's a lot more cases of coronavirus and they weren't telling the truth. And it's hard to regain trust once you've created that disinformation for people.
How important is data from China on this disease and the results they had in their containment and treatment efforts? How much do you trust that data?
It's hard to know how much to trust it. I think some of this is pride, some of this is uncertainty and not wanting, necessarily bad information out there. The contrast is, say, with Singapore, which has been fantastically transparent. All the data is available, and you have a lot of faith that you know exactly what's happening in that city-state. And that's the sort of model we all ought to adopt. But we do use the data. When people regularly say, well, 80% of people, it's a very mild case, or they're even asymptomatic. Well, that's based on data from China. We don't know, how reliable that is. And second of all, that might be slightly different in the United States. They have a very high smoking rate, for example, in China, especially among men. And that may be skewing. They may have more serious cases than we're likely to see, or we might see in the United States. On the other hand, we have more obese people, and that may skew it so that we have more serious and complicated cases. It's just hard to know how to extrapolate that data.
Former health policy advisor in the Obama White House, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, now Vice Provost of Global Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Good to speak with you.
Take care.
And you're listening to Boston Calling on the BBC World Service with me, Marco Werman. Coming up, a group of Mexican nurses has a message for you. Wash your hands. The hand-washing how-to video that's all over the internet. In the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, nearly 300 million children are skipping school with permission. Classes have been canceled in more than 20 countries, leaving some kids at loose ends. As Sarah Birnbaum has been finding out.
In India's capital, New Delhi, primary schools are now shut down until the end of the month. Teresa asked her 8-year-old son Shreyas what he thought about that.
I feel pretty good. I can play with my friends right now.
You think you will be only playing, or is there anything else you'll be doing in your time?
Yes, watching TV.
It's kind of adorable how he's totally missing his mom's point that maybe he could keep up with his schoolwork too.
You think you'll miss school?
No, never.
6-year-old Giorgio in Rome is on the same page.
I love staying at home with my mommy.
I asked Giorgio how he was keeping himself busy in addition to playing with mommy. He said he was doing homework and walking his dog. And his 4-year-old sister Emma wanted to add this footnote.
Come si dice in inglese mi piace.
I love my doggy.
I love my doggy and I love stay at home with my brother.
Oh. It's been a bit more trying for kids in China, which was the first country to suspend classes. 4-year-old Leo in Shanghai has been off since January 17th, and he really misses school. To ease the pain of separation a little, Leo's school lets kids call in 2 to 3 times a week to leave messages for each other and their teachers. This preschooler is saying, I really want to go back to school soon. All the messages sound like that. It kind of breaks your heart. In Tokyo, schools have been closed for about a week, and the local parks are filled with kids. But middle schooler Mika isn't going out much. She's focused on self-betterment.
It's like small goals they've like pushed away over time that now you have time to do. So I've been trying to learn to play a certain song on the piano. I feel like going out with my friends is a waste of like this whole closing school. Why? Because the goal was to reduce large get-togethers and like it doesn't need to be a large get-together.
It doesn't need to be a large get-together, says the exasperated older sister in high school, Leia. Somewhat ironic coming from you, says the younger sister.
Okay, well, what you do is a large get-together, so...
And remember, this is not a quarantine. Also, Leia isn't ignoring her schoolwork entirely. In fact, she has some advice for other kids who have to stay home from school.
Staying home is going to be a real test of your self-control, so don't slack off.
Hear that, kids? This is not a vacation.
Don't slack off and don't touch your face. Wow, a lot of work to do. Sarah Birnbaum reporting there. In China right now, the country where the new coronavirus originated, some areas are finally starting to lift lockdowns. Last month, a Chinese family that lives in California was visiting the city of Lanzhou in China. Unexpectedly, Elizabeth's son, her husband, and their kids all found themselves stuck in a lockdown that lasted weeks.
It's really scary. I don't want to bring my kids outside.
So she established a quarantine lesson plan.
Math, English, I really keep them busy. The idea is do something.
That was Elizabeth's son speaking a couple of weeks ago. This past week, our own Monica Campbell checked in with them to see how the family is doing now that the lockdown is slowly being lifted.
The other day, after nearly 6 weeks inside a tiny apartment, the kids finally went outside.
Everybody was so excited. I was very excited to bring them outside.
It was a chance to feel the sun and run, but after a few steps, Francine, who's 10, felt ill.
I felt like I was gonna throw up. I haven't been outside in a long time.
It was sensory overload.
The smells, definitely.
Like the smells of car exhaust?
Yeah.
Yes.
She doesn't feel well. Yeah, she said, oh, I want to go back to the apartment.
Elizabeth also worried when her boy Liam, he's 6 years old, got winded after just running a block. He'd been cooped up so long.
He was very slow.
The family sent me a video, and listen, you'll hear little Liam sprinting down the street like his old self.
Running around, you can see.
Normally, the family lives near San Francisco, but in January, they traveled to China to renew their U.S. work visas and see family. And they got stuck. The U.S. Embassy in Beijing still has their passports, which the parents turned over to start the visa process. It's unclear when those visas will be issued.
It's really hard. We're just waiting and waiting.
They were very relieved when the lockdown ended, but there's still a big challenge: face masks. They're required to wear them outside, and they're hard to find. Elizabeth says she rushed over when she spotted a woman selling masks on the street. She bought 50. That supply is dwindling. How many masks do you have right now on hand?
I still have 20, but
20 for the whole family.
yeah, for the whole family. Every time we go out, we need 4.
They only have 20 disposable masks left. Every family outing means using up 4 of the masks, and they must reserve enough to go out food shopping. So even though they can go outside, they really can't that often.
We don't have enough masks. We still stay in the home, stay in the apartment.
Unable to go outside much, they've started exercising indoors, running in place, doing calisthenics. I asked Francine, the daughter, her advice for parents if their kids are stuck inside for a long time.
Get them plenty of arts and craft materials. And let them play plenty of video games, and they won't bother you.
Francine has also been writing poetry about the virus.
No more salutations, no more greetings, and most definitely, no more meetings. The vendors and restaurants have shut down. It has become a very lonely town.
A reflection on life being far from normal.
A reminder of what many of us could yet experience. Monica Campbell there. In Mexico, 3 nurses have unintentionally become heroes in the fight against the coronavirus, thanks to a video that went viral, excuse the pun, teaching the rest of us how to wash our hands like real pros. Jorge Valencia has been checking it out.
The 3 nurses, they're wearing blue scrubs, standing in front of a painting with a serene waterfall, and they're dancing in place. And now we are going to teach you, they sing.
Yo soy la de la orilla derecha.
Xochitl Ruiz Morales tells me that in the video, she is the one on the right. And Rosalia Morales Toledo jokes that she is the one shaking her hips the most.
La que mueve más las caderas, dice Xochitl.
And Yesenia Benítez Colón is in the center.
Soy enfermera del Hospital de Alta Especialidad del Estado de Oaxaca.
The 3 of them are nurses at a hospital in Mexico's southern state of Oaxaca. And the video, they made it in Xochitl's house on one of their days off.
Bueno, lo hicimos en conmemoración del Día Internacional del Lavado de Manos.
Xochitl says they did it for Global Hand Washing Day. Yes, that is actually a thing.
Sí, sí existe.
It's on October 15th. It's sponsored by Colgate-Palmolive, the London School of Hygiene, and a few others. Management at the hospital in Oaxaca decided to have a contest ahead of the holiday.
Bueno, la idea surgió, yo creo que fue simultánea, ¿no?
Yesenia says she and her 2 friends together came up with the idea to make the video.
El beneficio de enfermería es que hay mucho trabajo en equipo.
The good thing about nursing is that you have to work as a team, Yesenia says. The 3 of them have become good friends. They've been working together for 8 years in the intensive care unit.
El ritmo de la música realmente se me ocurrió a mí, se me hizo una canción muy pegajosa.
Rosalia says she had the idea to use the beat from a song that was already popular. They wrote lyrics spelling out how they wash their hands at the hospital. They follow World Health Organization guidelines. They do it like 100 times a day, they say.
Ahí nos vemos súper serias, pero a punto de ganarnos la risa, Tardamos.
They barely even smile in the video, but Yesenia says they had to...
And more therapy for the patients. And I think this is really a time where those who suffer from mental illness are more vulnerable.
Absolutely. Dr. Motlana, as always, absolutely stunning advice. Efficient and to the point, and I hope we can have more conversations. The other issue I'd like to open up, I know you're very busy, is the psychiatric implications of extreme social distancing. But what we did cover, we covered very well, and I'm grateful. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Phoebe. Bye-bye.
Specialist psychiatrist, Dr. Mashari Motlana. I will send out that podcast link very quickly to you as well. Please share it, and please reflect on her advice. This is a time where we are talking a lot about the impact of the virus on the physical body, but we are not just bodies, we are psychosocial beings with mental health elements, and the mental health angle is crucial to pay attention to, even as we pay attention to the body as a physical vessel.
Movie night is the best night of the week for my family. Each one gets a turn to choose which movie we must all watch. I choose HOSMED Access for my family because I know that it caters for all our basic healthcare needs, just like this movie. If your color is green, HOSMED Access is for you.
That's right. HOSMED Medical Aid is about choice. Hashtag what's your color?
Get the Access plan. Call 0860 000048 now.
Same, but different. A truly unique South African saying to describe a truly unique South African success story. In the spotlight, this week on 702 is Investec Asset Management, now called 91. They're still the same company with the same people and passion for their client, but with a brand new name and identity. Join us this week on 702 as we find out more about the name change and why independence in the world of asset management is an advantage. 91. Investing for a world of change. Only on 702. For the curious, 91 is an authorized FSP.
What's the real cost of saying no to hiring youth? We've done the numbers and it's not looking good. There are currently 6.8 million unemployed youth in South Africa. Over their lifetime, they will end up costing the state around 1.2 million rand each. That kind of cost could cripple our country. It's enough to affect all of our futures. The good news is we can fix it. If each business in South Africa said yes to one youth, we could halve unemployment. Just like that. Sounds reasonable, right? Sign up at yesforyouth.co.za and join the over 100 companies that have gained higher triple BEE levels by saying yes to the youth of South Africa and yes to a better future for all of us.
8% return. No monthly fee. 12-month fixed deposit. At Sasfin Bank, we don't sugarcoat our offers. We tell it like it is. No stories, just facts. Visit sasfin.com for more. T's and C's apply. Sasfin, beyond a bank.
South Africa has the highest HIV/AIDS prevalence. Even though there are lots of campaigns aimed at managing the pandemic, the truth is that many people living with HIV live in shame and fear because of the stigma that comes with living with the virus. At Good Stories, we seek to change the way people view and experience HIV/AIDS to create HIV-friendly communities. But to continue spreading the message, we need your help. Visit our social platforms at Good Stories SA to find out how you can assist. This message is brought to you by Lead SA.
So does your bank really help you get my startup off the ground? Yep, I opened my FNB First Business Zero account on the app. Wait, are you serious? As serious as my business. No paperwork? Nope, I did it all on the app. And I can swipe my card as many times as I need to for free. But your monthly fee must be crazy, right? Nope, I don't pay a monthly account fee. Zero. And I get a free savings pocket. All that with a business account. And you won't believe this, the FNB app even lets me generate my own QR code so I get paid on the go. Why would a bank give you all this? Because when you're starting a business, you need to get up and running quickly. True. Now, are we done here? I've got a business to run. Okay.
Does your bank help you start your business like that? Download the FNB app or search First Business Zero. FNB is a division of First Rand Bank Limited, an authorized FSP and credit provider. T's and C's apply.
702. 702. We're listening.
That's all we have time for today. And remember, we're all in this together. This is a time for both extreme social distancing, but also for social cohesion and solidarity, not for brinkmanship. We'll bring you more as this virus continues to challenge us collectively in all sorts of ways. It is noon. Here's the latest in Eyewitness News.
This is Eyewitness News.
Good afternoon, I'm Tara Penny. We start with the latest COVID-19 developments.
We all now have turned ourselves into soldiers, ready to fight. When we say so, we say that every South African is a soldier, because each and everyone has to take responsibility to fight this infection.
Health Minister Zweli Mkhize says South Africa is dealing with an explosive increase in coronavirus cases.
We have actually seen that in the past week, this is today, up to day 10, we had actually increased from 1 to 51. That was actually doubling every second day. Now that for us is not just exponential, we think it's an explosive rise in the cases that are positive.
The number of confirmed infections in this country still stands at 61, but this number is expected to increase as more test results are due today. The minister says should the number of cases run into the hundreds of thousands, it would overwhelm South Africa's health sector.
Mind you, are still dealing with imported cases, which then becomes our biggest problem because each and every one of the individual is capable of creating their own mini outbreak. They can grow into, massive numbers of who are able to deal with the contacts.
Mkhize has revealed 2 medical professionals are among the 61 infected in South Africa, and he's confirmed the pair had recently travelled abroad. The minister says Limpopo has its first confirmed coronavirus case, a 29-year-old doctor who visited France and the Netherlands. Mpumalanga also has its second confirmed case, a 55-year-old man who travelled to France. Mkhize says they're waiting for test results which could point to an increase in local transmission. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says government is ready to spend money from the National Disaster Fund on the coronavirus response. However, he says the state will need to set aside further funding, which means government will have to reduce spending on other programs. Now, Parliament has postponed public hearings on land expropriation without compensation as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. The chairperson of the ad hoc committee responsible for amending the legislation, Matole Motshekga, has decided to postpone all committee activities. Babalo Ndenze takes a look.
The Ad Hoc Committee on Land Expropriation joins other parliamentary structures which have had to change their work diaries. The National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces have both cancelled a sitting to deal with legislation as well as public meetings in Gauteng. Committee Chairperson Matole Motshekga says given the situation's been declared a national disaster, it is in the interest of all South Africans to postpone the hearings until further notice. A comprehensive announcement regarding the program of both Houses of Parliament will be made after a meeting of presiding officers and chief whips tomorrow. Babalo Ndenze, Eyewitness News, Parliament.
Bars, restaurants, theatres and movie houses in New York and Los Angeles have been ordered to shut down to combat the spread of the coronavirus pandemic as central banks around the world take aggressive steps to cushion the economic impact of the disease. The U.S. Federal Reserve slashed interest rates for the second time in less than 2 weeks to near zero, and other central banks followed suit. But stock markets and the dollar continued to tumble. Europe's main stocks markets plunged more than 6% in brutal opening trading today, while Wall Street futures for the S&P 500 index had hit their down limit in the first quarter hour of Asian traders' investors' rush for safety. Leaders of the G7 countries will hold a video conference later on this afternoon to discuss a joint response to the coronavirus outbreak. Other stories making news now. Justice Minister Ronald Lamola has denied Chris Hani's killer, Janusz Walusz, parole. Walusz is currently serving a life sentence for the killing of the SACP leader outside his Boksburg home in 1993. In his decision, the Minister Lamola says it's clear that the political assassination of Hani was executed with the intention to create chaos and mayhem in this country. The Justice Minister says Hani's killing was intended and had the potential to bring about civil war within the Republic at the time. His spokesperson, Crispin Piri.
When taking this decision, Minister Lamola had regard to the full record of this matter, which includes the latest profile of the offender, previous judgments by the High Court, the Supreme Court, as well as reports and submissions made by the South African Communist Party and Mrs. Limpo Hani, the widow.
Old Mutual's interim CEO, Ian Williamson, says the board wants to appoint a new chief executive within a few months. He made the comments earlier today while announcing the insurer's full-year results and an 8.5% drop in its shares. The company's share drop comes after the stock sunk in 2019, partly due to a spat with former boss Peter Moyo over his abrupt sacking in June following a dispute over a conflict of interest. While Williamson said the hunt for a new CEO is underway, he deferred questions on what stage the process is at and possible timeframes to the board. And Eskom says its system remains vulnerable and constrained. The utility says it's not planning to implement load shedding today, but it is having to use emergency reserves to supplement supply during peak hours. Eskom is warning the possibility of rolling blackouts remains high should there be any change in performance on the grid. Gold's at $1,525.86 an ounce. The rand's at 16.60 to the dollar, 20.37 to the pound, 18.58 to the euro. Brent crude oil's at $31.26 a barrel.
In Midrand, Ellendale Road between Greg and Maple Drive will be closed off to traffic for the next 3 months. This is due to major roadworks. Traffic lights are still out of order in Melrose at Athol Oaklands and the M1. And there's also faulty traffic lights in Midrand at Olifantsfontein Road and Lever.
It's a partly cloudy day in Gauteng with isolated thundershowers expected. The temperatures will peak at highs of 24 and 27 degrees. The developing story in Eyewitness News this hour. Health Minister Zweli Mkhize says South Africa is dealing with an explosive increase in coronavirus cases.
Eyewitness News. In touch, in tune, and independent. For the latest, visit ewn.co.za.
We're celebrating 40 years of listening, and we're ready to listen some more. 702
on 92.7
and 106 FM.
Streaming on 702.co.za, the 702 app, and on DSTV channel 856.
7 minutes after 12. Dumelang, good afternoon. You are on 702 and Cape Talk. My name is Clement Banyatela, with you until 1 p.m. this afternoon. President Cyril Ramaphosa has declared the coronavirus a national disaster, announcing drastic measures aimed at containing the spread of the virus. So far, 61 people have tested positive for this virus in the country. We'll spend this entire hour bringing you up to speed with the latest information you need to know about COVID-19, government's response, and how you are going to be affected. On that note, this leads. Government says it's investigating 4 more cases of possible internal transmission. It's calling on South Africans to adhere to the restrictions and measures announced by government in order to contain the spread of the virus. Also, get ready for more drastic measures. Government says we must ready ourselves for hard combat. It says the state of emergency hasn't been ruled out. What would this mean for you and me? We'll find out. And then we'll begin counting the possible cost to the economy and what measures are needed to cushion the blow. Should the Reserve Bank cut interest rates? That conversation also coming up. Plus, there are calls for unity between various stakeholders, from communities to business, labor, government, even religious organizations. Are we all united in fighting this? What role are you playing as an ordinary South African, as employers, as parents, to help and be in unison with governments? Let's chat about that and exchange some tips. All of this and more coming up between now and 1 p.m. So if you have any questions, any comment, you want to engage and connect with us, you can call us on 011-883-0702. In Cape Town, 021-446-0567. You can also send your SMSs to 31702 and 31567. Your WhatsApp voice notes can be sent to 072-702-1702.
702 for the curious.
Streaming countrywide on the 702 app.
All right, let's just do this quickly. News breaking a short while ago. The Justice Ministry announcing that Chris Honey's killer, Janusz Values, has now been denied parole. You'll remember that in December, the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria instructed Lamula to reconsider the matter within 60 days. Values is serving a life sentence at Kgosi Mampuru Correctional Center in Pretoria. He assassinated Hani, the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, in 1993. Crispin Piri is the spokesperson for the Justice and Correctional Services Department. Crispin, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Speak to us about the reasoning behind this denial to grant Chris Honey's killer parole.
Yeah, so the decision was taken upon balancing both positive factors and negative factors that are attributed to Mr. Walus. And in the main, the minister, when looking at the effect of granting Mr. Walus parole, considered that it would not actually give effect to the severity of the sentence that the court had wanted. So one of the effects is that Mr. Walus was sentenced in terms of the old act, the old Correctional Services Act. And in terms of that act, when an individual is granted parole, a life has granted parole, after a certain period, they then can be deemed to be free, essentially. And in terms of when we did our calculations now, when we look at it, notwithstanding all the remissions that have been granted by the previous administration, it would effectively mean that Mr. Walus's sentence is effectively commuted. And that we understand not to be the intention of the court when sentencing him, to ensuring that he has a severe sentence. And if you look at one of the remarks that the court made in that, especially the essay in convicting Mr. Walus, one of the things that they said was that the killing was a cold-blooded attack. After the first bullet struck him, the accused came up close and administered a coup de grace at a close range. And that is quite a descriptive detail of how the killing happened. Essentially, a coup de grace is walking up to someone and finishing them off. And the court also mentioned that this was a defenseless victim. But most importantly, we take into account that the court also said that the effect of this crime could have plunged the country into a civil war, and in fact that was the intention of the accused at the time. So all of those factors had to be taken into consideration to say, well, in this regard, can we say that granting this individual parole is actually giving effect to what the court had sought?
All right. Listen, thank you so much for coming through. Crispin Piri, Justice and Correctional Services Minister spokesperson, updating us on that decision to deny Chris Hanni's killer parole. It's 13 minutes after 12.
Connect.
Engage.
Change.
This is 702.
This